Awesome. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of regulation. And the main takeaway I want you to have from this is pretty much ever since we had an American government, the amount of regulation of the government towards business has just been increasing. It may not have increased a whole lot until the early 1900s, especially starting with World War I, but it has always been on a consistent uptick. So we've got kind of different waves of regulation. In wave one, this is kind of the early America, and then all the way up to about the after the Civil War. But originally, regulations were designed to be promotional for business. Regulations exist to make business easier. Some of the early regulatory agencies that came up during this period were groups like the Patent and Trademark Office in 1836, the Copyright Office in 1870, Bureau of Fisheries in 1871, and the Comptroller of Currency in 1863. Then we have Wave 2. And this is around 1887. Congress starts building this prototype of a modern federal regulatory authority when it comes up with the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC. And this was specifically designed to regulate railroads. Railroads transformed America into almost like individual state markets into a national market, and there had to be a way to regulate commerce between states. And the ICC was what we would call an independent regulatory commission. An independent regulatory commission is an agency that's run by a very small group of commissioners, and they're generally seen as independent of political control. They are career bureaucrats, and because they are career bureaucrats, they are not necessarily accountable to politicians, nor are they accountable to the electorate, only to the regulations which guide that organization. Now, also during Wave 2, around 1914, we established the Federal Trade Commission, which was basically designed to regulate and also break up the large dominant trusts that existed in many industries. Again, think of Rockefeller, Standard Oil, Vanderbilt, and the railroads, these kinds of large trusts. By the 1930s, there were 7 new regulatory commissions regulating business. So again, you see more and more regulation. Then we have Wave 3. Wave 3 started with the Great Depression, and that was for federal, it started with the Great Depression, and that's when Franklin Delano Roosevelt proposed a New Deal, which was a series of programs designed to bring relief, recovery, and reform. And these new laws were very quickly challenged by the Supreme Court, and they were deemed unconstitutional. So what FDR did in response was he proposed a plan to say that he would appoint 1 new justice to the Supreme Court for every justice over 70 who didn't retire. This would basically mean that he could put people in the Supreme Court who would be more favorable to passing his New Deal regulations, and the Supreme Court, of course, buckled, and they allowed him to pass his New Deal regulations. So Wave 3, to characterize that one, would be that now government has shifted from being promotional for business to actually being allowed to regulate business to ensure that the market economy functions properly. Then we have Wave 4. So during the 60s and 70s, of course, as we mentioned, you had a large degree of skepticism directed at government. So there were a lot of new controls designed to achieve a lot of broad societal objectives in response to what the electorate was demanding of their politicians. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these new agencies later in this course, but some of them to remember were things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, to make sure that minorities had good and equal opportunities to get a job. We had the Consumer Product Safety Commission, making sure that dangerous products weren't on the market, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as well. And most of these new authorities became executive agencies. I'll talk about that right now. And an executive agency is a regulatory body in the executive branch, typically run by a single administrator. The heads of these agencies are typically appointed by the president, and these individuals are normally career bureaucrats who are accountable only to the president, not necessarily to the electorate nor to Congress. Now, also what started happening towards the end of Wave 4 is that regulations designed to achieve kind of social aims were coupled with a deregulation movement. So you have the social side being more important in terms of regulation, but in terms of governing what an industry should do, you had a decrease. So deregulation is, of course, the removal or a significant reduction of a body of regulation covering an industry. Wave 5. Now, towards the end of the fourth wave, again, there was this idea, kind of coupled with deregulation, that regulations had become excessive and they needed to be trimmed back. And this was kind of the Clinton years, the 90s in the United States, where it was kind of a golden age of business. However, there was a new surge of activity during Wave 5, and that was 9/11. And that meant that there were a large number of regulations designed to provide American security and also help with the financial crisis that followed 9/11. And so the Federal Reserve Board and the Department of Treasury intervened to prevent some sort of a panic and system collapse. One of the kind of projects of Wave 5 was TARP. TARP was Troubled Asset Relief Program, and it was a program where federal regulators had the power to exchange funds for an ownership interest in banks and corporations. So they got the bailouts from the government, but the government was able to impose restrictions and basically, in addition to restrictions, basically dictate what those corporations could do because now they were shareholders. And TARP is, of course, administered by the Office of Financial Stability, which is part of the Treasury Department. Now, one other thing when we talk about these different waves that I want you to remember is that during wars, you typically have kind of an uptick in regulation. During the Civil War, it kind of started where the North created the national banking system designed to finance the war. World War I was a total war, so our entire country was mobilized to support the war effort. And of course, the same thing happened during World War II and to a lesser extent, the Korean War. We didn't have a whole lot of comparable increases in regulation during Vietnam or the Gulf Wars, or really even the global war on terror, again, because these were not formally declared wars and they were not total war. You did not mobilize an entire society behind these wars as we did previously. So now, in the next video, we're going to talk about how actual regulations are formed and how they are executed and kind of some of the problems that are associated with that. I'm looking forward to seeing you then.